please.
Hello, my name's Rod Ulrich. I portray a sergeant in the Royal Field Artillery of the First World War, and my detachment who fire for the Garrison Living History Group our 18-pounder field gun.
That's an 18-pounder. Were they standard issue?
It's a standard issue field piece. The lighter gun called a 13-pounder, which looks very, very similar, was the standard issue field piece for the Royal Horse Artillery, who were with the cavalry.
What's the difference between the Field Artillery and the Royal Horse Artillery?
The Royal Horse Artillery are a lot lighter mounted. They keep up with the cavalry. We are Field Artillery. We stay up with the infantry, so we can be a little bit heavier, a little bit slower moving.
So the Royal Field Artillery are 18-pounders?
Correct.
And the Royal Horse Artillery are
13-pounders.
13-pounders. And just that few pounds makes a lot of difference?
Yes, because it's saved all over the whole carriage, over the whole thing. It makes it a lot lighter for the horses to tow.
So does that mean, with the Field Artillery, I believe you had 6 horses?
Correct.
How many could you have for the lighter? It was 4?
It was still 6 horses. They just moved quicker.
There was an awful lot of horses in the First World War.
An awful lot of horses. They estimate about 9 million horses were used.
I spoke to a 100-year-old ex-driver, and he told me that most of them came from Australia.
The horses, a lot of them came in from all over the empire. Outside of the empire, it was the United States and Argentina who served on. And again, you had horses for different things. You obviously had chargers for the cavalry, you had lighter horses for ambulances and things like that, and you had, for the artillery, you have what you call a vanner, which was a horse that would tow a delivery van. And because they're still a draft animal, but they're a little lighter and a little smaller.
Sounds like a buzz bomb coming over.
I'm afraid it's the 21st century getting in the way.
Rather sadly, after the war, is it true that the French ate them all for horse meat?
Well, a lot of the cavalry chargers were kept because they were the expensive versions. The lighter horses and the mules and all the work-a-day horses. I mean, people think that the British Army just worked the horses to death or worked them into the ground. They didn't. There was veterinary hospitals, there was horse hospitals, there was all sorts of support. There's a book that I've got on there which is field artillery training, and about 1/3 of the book is devoted to gunnery, 2/3 of the book is devoted to the equitation of horses, the driving, the care and the veterinary care of horses.
Interestingly, it's Bill Cotgrove was his name, he was a driver. He went over to the Somme, returned to the Somme a few years ago on his 101st birthday. You will find that on the great YouTube. But he said, interestingly enough, he didn't think that the horses were affected by gas.
My granddad was a carter in civilian life, and he served in an infantry battalion, but as part of the transport company. The only protection they had for the horses officially was to put the feed bag on them and tie that up around their muzzle as tight as you could get it. Blister agents and that sort of thing would affect the horses, but again, they tried to keep them out of it as much as possible. I mean, as I said earlier, the guys really did care for their horses. My grandfather used to curse the people that used to make them stand on wet, muddy trench lines. Horse lines. And because the horses would stand there tethered on a rope, and of course horses do what horses do best, and all they were stood on, if they're lucky, was either mud or straw, so that would really affect their feet. And he said all they had to do was move the horse lines every couple of days, and you keep the horses healthier, but the army way was not to, for whatever reason, presumably because they had limited ground. Because obviously once a horse has fouled the ground, nobody else can go onto it. But
has the 18-pounder changed since Waterloo?
Well, basically it looks like a gun that you would have used at Waterloo, but in fact technology-wise it is as far from Waterloo almost as the space shuttle. Yeah, it's, as you can see, it fires shells from cartridges, it uses cordite as propellant, it uses Luddite and TNT as its explosive part. It's breech loading, it's rifled, and of course one of the important things is it's got a recoil system on it, which means that the gun stays exactly where it is when you fire it. There's no rolling back or anything like that. And so as a firing platform and as an ordnance for repeatedly and accurately placing shot, it is second to none.
So that must have continued up to the Second World War, presumably, with such a good dimensions and.
The basic gun that you see there is a Mark II, and that would have remained fairly unchanged until the end of the First World War. The real difference between that and the later Marks was the system of buffer and recuperator for controlling the recoil. The later ones were a hydro-pneumatic system where that is just basically like a posh car shock absorber.
But it did work.
Worked very well. Yeah. Later on, they developed trails, split trails, pneumatic tyres, so that you could tow it behind a gun. The last incarnation really was called an 18 25-pounder, which was the 18-pounder ordnance rechambered for 25-pound rounds. I mean, the 25-pounder, like you see in the centre of the square there, was developed using the experience of this gun. Its limitations really are the fact that it's limited on range because it's got a single pole trail. And obviously you can't elevate the barrel any higher than the breech block on the trail.
So you couldn't get any aircraft down, presumably?
Not really, not really. Although the 13-pounder, which was found to be far too light really, and apart from in 1914 relatively ineffective, what they found was if they put it on a high angle mounting and then used a 13-pounder shell on an 18-pounder cartridge,
you could send it further.
You would get it up there, and that is one of the very first anti-aircraft guns, all mounted on lorries.
Took a bit of time to aim it, surely, though.
It must have been fairly haphazard, but you had various spotters and all the rest of it. Sort of thing. They were reasonably effective for their time.
Tell us a bit about the history of this particular 18-pounder. What is it?
It's an 18-pounder Mark II. It's on a Mark II carriage dated 1915. The ordnance, i.e. the barrel and the recoil system, are dated 1918. Hopefully, we would suggest that being a 1915 date, that the carriage at least saw action. There's no guarantee that the ordnance did. It must have remained in a trading role because it's not been mucked about with or converted or done anything with it. But it ended up with 214 Worcester battery as a gate guard and as a ceremonial piece. They turned round to the Royal Artillery and said, "We've got this, we don't really use it anymore." The Royal Artillery, which we're lucky enough to be associated with, turned around and said, "Could you look after an 18-pounder? It will need restoring." So we looked round. There was several significant pieces of it missing. I mean, the guns were de-rolled and re-rolled through their life, so it's not surprising that bits changed. We contacted the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery at Woolwich, who very kindly lent us some instruments and bits and bobs and documentation so that we could more easily restore it. And then basically put our hands in our pockets, and she's here today.
That's why you call it a 18-pounder. What, a couple of zeros on the end, perhaps?
Well, yeah, quite possibly.
So she's your pride and joy?
I love it, yeah. I mean, I learnt my craft on the 25-pounder, and it's a slightly odd gun to use compared to a 25-pounder. But the association with my own family members and all the rest of it, yeah, I've got a soft spot for it.
So where do you get the what would they call, dummy rounds?
Well, the cartridges are actually 18-pounder cartridges with the shell taken off them. And what we use then is we load blank rounds every time with black powder. So obviously you've got to have firearm certificates and powder licences and all the paraphernalia that go with that.
And how are you marking today? This great day? Basically,
by remembering ourselves of family members and relatives who fought in the Great War, and again, just bringing it out to the people. There's been fantastic interest from people, little kids all the way up, of the equipment, the lives of the soldiers, how to research the soldiers, and of course the gun is, if you like, just a spectacular way of trying to demonstrate it.
Are you still recruiting?
We're still recruiting. If anyone wants to come and join the Garrison, by all means look on our website, which is the Garrison Living History Group.org.uk, and if you're interested in First World War, it might be Second World War or anti-aircraft, then I'm sure we've got something to interest you.
This will reignite people's interest, won't it?
I do hope so. The First World War has always been seen as rather a bit of a pointless sacrifice from the 1960s onwards. this might sound a little bit revisionist, but my grandfather, whilst he hated his time in the army, even though he volunteered in 1914, he knew that he had done the right thing and that the Germans had to be stopped in 1418 absolutely as much as they had to be stopped in 1945. It was a very, very bloody sacrifice, I will certainly acknowledge that, but at the same time we owe everything in our modern world to what those guys did in the 1418 war. Take post! You still have a basic detachment of 5 guys from the 10 available. The horses are still kept behind the lines, ready just in case we have to move the guns forward, but obviously they're far safer and far better looked after there. Now the guys are ranging the gun in, making sure that all the sights are on.
5,400 yards max.
Thank you.
Set 4,400.
Thank you. Right, so he's just told me that the gun in this position has got a maximum range of 5,400 yards. Check? Yeah, but we know that our target, which is an enemy bunker, which is a command bunker, so it's important to the enemy, and he directs all the other machine guns and the defences, so we really want to hit them and let them know that we can take them out anytime we like. It's such an important target that we've got air cover. There is an aeroplane, a little 2-seater, flying what they call a racetrack course, which is like a lazy figure of 8, over the German front lines, protected by our fighter aircraft, and what he's going to do is he's going to spot the guns. Because of all the instrumentation and all the rest of it and the survey, we know that that target is roughly 4,000 yards away in a direct line off the end of our barrel. We're going to use high explosive to try and blow in his bunker. But what we're waiting for is the command post and the aircraft, which may be relayed through several stations and telephone junctions, to turn around and say that they're on, and we'll get a ready signal. And an officer from the tent lines will turn around and say, number 1 gun, ready? HE, 4,000 yards. 1 round ranging, load. Number 1 gun ready, sir. So now we know we've got a bearing, we've got a range, we've got a type of ammunition, and we know that we're doing what they call an air shoot. Yeah, liaison with air. So they now told the aircraft we're ready, so the pilot and the observer, who don't have to worry about enemy fighters because they've got their own escort, will look at the target and then buzz back and say fire. Or shoot is what they used to say. Right? That comes through to my CP, the CP turns around, number 1 gun, fire! Now we have to wait 7, 8, 9 seconds for that shell to fly through the air, and then the crew with the aircraft will concentrate on the target, and if we're any damn good at it, yeah, hopefully somewhere near that target they'll see the explosion. They will then work out using a clock face, 12, 6, 3, 9, and various distances like a bullseye to turn around what the connection is.
I think they're going to do it another one now.
Number 1 gun, correction. Up 50, left 5.
Oh, I see where they shot it.
Set, 18, 1 round ranging. No!
What? Listen to how much it is.
Now we're not that far off the target. The guy's flying round again. He's turned round. We've turned round. We've acknowledged the correction. We've told him we're now ready with the next round. So he signalled back shoot. That's come through the chain of command. And 1 gun. Fire!
Did that scare you? No, the first time it scared us. The first time it scared you.
And me.
You wouldn't even hear
That shell
them, Bill.
has landed within 25 yards of the bunker.
This
So what we're going to do now is we've got the whole battery.
It's the first time for me.
We've followed all those directions. So we've got all 8 guns, all loaded with HE. They all know roughly what the range, the bearing, and the ammunition is. So what we're going to do now is a battery shoot, which means that we're going to drench that target with high explosives and really give it a frick. Another step closer to kicking the Kaiser out of Berlin, and hopefully more British and Empire lives saved.
Watch. There's going to be a little bit and it's going
Confirmed on target. 4 rounds, gunfire.
The birds might hold
Carry on.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Go on, get on it. Fire! Now you see why we call it quick fire.
Ooh, that one is a win.
Look at all the birds.
Confirm guns empty. Gun empty. Stand by. Just in case we've got to repeat the fire mission. So now the aircraft has watched all these shells land on this target, hopefully destroying it. Another tick in the box. Another step closer to victory. Hopefully more lives saved. The aircraft's buzzed back, confirmed target destroyed. He will then fly on to his next sortie to range for another battery of guns somewhere along the western front. Press stop.
Now they're going to shoot it down.
I don't think they're going to shoot it no more, guys.
Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, the Garrison.
Okay, I think that's enough.
My personal connection with the Great War is on my side of the family and my wife's side of the family. As far as I know, there was only one Ulrich who served the colours. He was wounded and survived the war. On my mother's side of the family, there were 13 children, of which there were 4 brothers who went into the army, and there was numerous cousins and second cousins as well. One of my grandfather's elder brothers was a reservist. He went straight to the colours in August 1914. He was in the Rifle Brigade, and he went overseas in August, and he was killed somewhere near Ypres, we don't know where, but he's commemorated on the Plug Street Memorial on the 23rd of October 1914. My grandfather never ever found out what happened to him as a reinforcement. I don't expect he was well known by many of the people in his unit. The other brothers all went to go and join up in August 1914. My grandfather wanted to be a Royal Marine. He got on the bus and the train and everything at Chichester to go to Portsmouth, got to the Marine recruiting establishment at Portsmouth, and they didn't like him because they said he had a bit of a cold and they didn't want to sign him on if that head cold got any worse. So he went back to huge sort of ribald comments from his brothers saying, well, you'll just have to join the Royal Sussex like the rest of us. They all marched into Chichester, they were recruited, and they all became members of the 7th Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment. They went overseas in May 1915, and he spent the entire war on the Western Front. His elder brother, as in the brother older than him, was killed in January 1916 during a change around in the line, one battalion taking over from another. The composite company, which was the rear guard of the Royal Sussex, came under shell fire, and unfortunately Morris was hit with shrapnel, and he died of his wounds later that same afternoon. Another brother who had already attested under the Derby scheme, which meant that he wasn't conscripted, he had already volunteered but was going to get called forward. He was in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He was gassed and wounded once, and another elder brother was in the transport company of one of the battalions of the Hampshire Regiment. On my wife's side of the family, her mother's, both brothers were killed. One as a commissioned officer in the Norfolk Regiment. He had gone through the Middlesex and had been commissioned. The other one first joined the Warwickshire Regiment and then transferred to the Ox and Bucks, and he was wounded and taken prisoner during the huge great German advance in March 1918 and died in a German base hospital at a French town called Valenciennes, and he's buried there. Morris is buried in Bethune in the cemetery there, and lots of members of the family have been out there just to say hello. They're not forgotten. And I've also taken my father-in-law to Tyne Cot Cemetery in Passchendaele, where Lewis has his name on the monument there.
It's testimony to the fact that maybe forgotten, or you might not know, but everybody had a part to play in the First World War.
Absolutely.
Everybody's ancestor.
Absolutely.
If you have English-British roots here, you did. Even if you were a conscientious objector, you had a part to play. Nobody escaped the First World War.
I mean, my father-in-law's father, he volunteered for the Royal Naval Air Service, and he went out to France initially, and he was sent back home to the UK, and then transferred down to Tresco in the Isles of Scilly, where he was on a flying boat unit, and they were looking after the Felixstowe and Curtis America big twin-engine flying boats that were doing the anti-U-boat patrols on the western approaches. Lots of other members of the family all stayed and worked on the farm. My grandfather's trade was a carter, so he ended up in the Royal Sussex Regiment as part of the transport section, and they would move all the guns, ammunition, the infantry battalion's equipment and rations. It was a constant conveyor belt, moving kit towards the front lines.
But even fit men, not all fit men, went to war. A lot of people stayed at home here. And is it reserved occupations?
Reserved occupations, yes.
So it's a myth to think that every young fit man was over there. Presumably the ones that stayed behind had white feathers in the post, did they?
Well, I suppose there was an element of that. I mean, you can gauge that by the fact that even now, if you look on places like eBay and you go to military affairs, you will see badges, silver badges and things like that that say on government service or on imperial service. I mean, it's no good if you want to make millions and millions of shells. It's no good if all the tool makers at Woolwich go and join up to be infantrymen. They're far more use, making, the tools that make the shells than the munitions.
But when they were out and about relaxing and enjoying themselves, they made sure they had an official badge.
And anywhere, you could be accosted at any time. Yeah. Why aren't you in uniform? You look to be a young, fit man. The famous poster of the father sitting in the armchair with his children. What did you do in the Great War, Daddy? Yeah, there was a lot of pressure on guys to join up. But at the same time, there was a lot of economic pressure. People think of the Second World War as being the one time when this country really pulled together, the Dunkirk spirit, the Blitz spirit. But if you look back 22 years further on, you had land army girls, you had forestry girls, you had the girls in the ammunition factories, in the armaments factories, you had
Dad's army.
You had a home service army. There was still more than 1 million men in uniform guarding Great Britain in 1918. When Haig was desperate for more soldiers on the front in 1918. He wanted to comb out the remainder of the fit men on home service, and Lloyd George wouldn't let him because he says, you murdered the last lot by sending them into the mud at Passchendaele. I'm not giving you any more.
Is that true?
No, that's a simplification of it. But Lloyd George realised that you just could not keep using young fit manhood by the same way and encouraging him to change tactics and try and use different ways. I mean, Haig has had a good stroke bad stroke indifferent press ever since the end of the First World War. But basically, he was the one guy in 1918 that commanded the only victorious army in the field on the Western Front.
So what else are you going to do to commemorate the 100th?
We've got a programme of events now that certainly stretches into the next 3 years with the 18-pounder.
Really?
There's obviously any opportunity to go across to France and to do it there would be nice. That relies on the French and the Belgian authorities actually allowing us to take a field artillery piece there.
They've got plenty in the agricultural fields still, they're digging up.
Well, the iron harvest, I know a Belgian fireman who's an ex-army chap who does a very similar thing with the Belgian forts near Antwerp as to we do here at Tilbury Fort. And I don't think it's a huge secret that if nobody else ever discovers a chemical munition in Belgium, i.e. a gas bomb, a gas shell, anything like that, mustard gas, then it's going to take them over 90 years to deactivate what they've got held in storage. There is a phenomenal amount of ordnance still left on the First World War battlefields.
And it's still taking out tractor boys.
Indeed, it's something that's designed to kill someone never loses the ability to do that until it actually goes bang. The amount of ordnance that is laying around, and the French call it the iron harvest, in the fields is a constant threat to anyone. So people who think, oh, I'd love to walk in these fields where the trenches were, you really have to be careful. And whatever you do, please do not try and bring home souvenirs.
Don't do this at home.
They are a lot more dangerous than you think. You think, oh, it's only a small hand grenade. A small hand grenade in a private car would kill everyone in it if it went off. And of course, customs, if they find you, will not treat you as a souvenir hunter. They will treat you as an arms smuggler.
Anything else you'd like to say to camera about this glorious day? Or inglorious, which is it?
It's definitely a commemoration. You cannot call it a celebration. You can celebrate what that generation did, but you should always commemorate the loss that achieved it. It changed this country, it changed Europe, it changed the world. It was quite possibly one of the two biggest cataclysms in recent living memory. I would imagine that the same shock on people's faces as I witnessed on colleagues when we saw the 9/11 incident unfolding before our eyes. You realise that that is like a line in the sand. The world will not be the same tomorrow. And I think we should look back on that, look at the achievement of what that generation achieved, what the subsequent generations achieved after it, and look at it in a positive light, saying that we live in a much better world now because of their efforts and despite the sacrifice.
What was the Kaiser's ultimate plan had we not entered, or had we lost? What was his plan? Just to move into Paris and enjoy himself, or was he going to invade?
In the simplest terms, the Kaiser wanted to be the top dog in Europe. He wanted to be, if you like, the nation in the centre of Europe that all European culture and economies orbited around.
You mean like the European Union?
No, that's a very different thing. The Kaiser was not a constitutional monarch. Neither was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, neither was the Russian Empire. When it came to constitutional monarchies, there was Britain, there was Belgium, there was Holland, and Denmark. When of course Norway as well. And their whole thing was that a parliament governed their people. In Germany they had a parliament, but it had no real power, because if the Kaiser said we're going to war, you went to war. You know, everyone's been talking about it this week, about how Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, turned around and said we can either go to war, in which case there will be a huge sacrifice and a major economic effort, or we can stay out of it, in which case we will still lose out in economic terms, and we will still sooner or later have to go to war. It's take the clock back another 100 years to Waterloo, and then Europe couldn't afford to have Napoleon running Europe on his own. Nobody could afford to have the Kaiser running on her own. Britain was left out alone of it because we had a huge, great empire, so we looked outside of Europe. I mean, the American War taught us that you can't automatically put your own take on everything, that people won't agree with you and they want their independence. And of course, the First World War, in its own way, was the first step for most of the empire becoming independent. You know, you had the dominions, they're almost like the independent dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. South Africa, of course, had only been in the empire collectively post the Boer War 10 years.
And General Smuts was in the War Cabinet.
General Smuts, again, an ex-Boer commando leader, but a very clever man. A man ultimately responsible for things like the formation of the Royal Air Force. And in the Second World War, again, he was a main driver on policy, and he had a good political head on his shoulders, even though he was a military man. Yeah, no one country can dominate an entire sphere. I mean, at the moment, people look and say, oh, America this, America that. Well, America took on the role that Britain had up until 1945 of global policeman. You know, it was Britain who destroyed the slave trade. All right, at one time, we were the biggest supporters of it. But when we decided that we were now anti-slavery, we virtually eradicated it as far as we could from the planet. The welfare state was being introduced. There were plans for a very limited national health. All these plans were, the Liberal government in 1914 were keen to bring all these things in. And yet, on the other hand, economically, the British Empire was costing us a fortune. There was, I think it was 24% of the gross national product in 1914 was going into the Navy to build dreadnoughts. That's the sort of economic burden that you can't even sustain, not even in today's world, you could say. But that was the threat at the time. That is what people decided to spend their money on.
So did we win the war?
Did we win the war? I would say, and greater minds than me may disagree, but I would say that yes, collectively the Allies won the First World War. The German army was in full retreat. It was still an effective army. It hadn't disintegrated like it did in 1945. But there was nowhere for the German army to stand and fight. The British and Empire armies, with American assistance, had the reserve of manpower. They insisted upon an armistice rather than actually having an occupying power.